In the heart of Kenya's wild and untamed wilderness, an extraordinary true story unfolds. Witnessed by the late Pastor C.D. Brooks as narrated in his unforgettable sermon, the Adventist Book Reviews proudly present Assault on the Tower. This cinematic journey will awaken shepherds and laity alike, igniting a renewed sense of vigilance and spiritual responsibility. We thank Bread of Life for availing the late C.D. Brooks sermons, and also the congregational singing at Windhoek Central SDA Church for their performance at the close of this film. God bless you and stay tuned.
Last fall, I was taken in a car with Elder and Mrs. Woodfork to a wild animal preserve in Kenya. And very soon we encountered herds of giraffes and swarms of warthogs, zebra, large herds of wildebeest and other creatures. Mrs. Woodfork wanted desperately to photograph a lion. In spite of all the animals we were seeing, she wanted to see His Royal Majesty in his own domain. At one point as we drove along, I looked out across the veldt and I saw an unusual mound or tower, an eminence. It was bald, and on top of it, standing shoulder to shoulder and flank to flank, were 4 wildebeests. Obviously, they were sentinels, looking after hundreds of their grazing companions. These sturdy bulls were silhouetted dark and strong against the azure sky. Their horns looked like crossed sickles, and they hardly moved at all. I think this is what caught my eye above everything else. They were as still as death. It indicated for me the diligence necessary if you're going to be a watchman. National Geographic magazine tells me that bulls and stags and stallions often guard their harems in this manner. They will choose high ground so as to be able to look favorably to the 4 winds, that they might perceive advancing danger. This indicates that watching for the sentinel is more vital than grazing. We drove near these grand animals and discovered a lion resting on the opposite side of the road. That lion seemed perfectly unconcerned and detached. We continued our interesting journey, and about an hour later we doubled back, and these 4 beasts were still standing there, but the lion had crossed the road. And when we noticed him, he was stalking through the tall grass, being careful to remain upwind. And we saw that he was headed straight for the watchman. Several cars had stopped their engines. Camera eyes were peeking out into the grass. This giant cat would creep a few feet and then pause, his tawny hide matching the tawny grass. Stealthily he moved. Patiently he advanced. Timing for him was very important. His instincts were honed by nature and experience. I have seen yard cats do this. trying to mesmerize birds and lizards and mice, and one thing you know when they're doing it, they are all business. This was an exciting spectacle. The zebras in their exotic clothes had seen the lion cross the road. And now every one of them within sight was standing still with head high, ears pointed forward, and all eyes set on the lion. The zebras were on the right side of the road. A half dozen ostriches were off to my left. Their strange bodies, necks looking like poles topped by weird little heads, all of them were watching the lion. On he crept, headed for the watchman. Sometimes the lion seemed to disappear altogether. Then he would re-emerge. He was an unrelenting adversary, crouching low, waiting for opportunity to spring. And those bulls stood lazily, only their tails switching. For them it seemed that flies and insects were their biggest bother and threat. As a matter of fact, they were so complacent, it appeared that they misunderstood the solemnity of their calling. They had lost their sense of urgency and didn't understand the danger. They had been standing there so long. Two of them finally resigned from the tower, probably considering their vocation dull and unremunerative. They probably felt that things were so uneventful on the tower, it was better to crop dry, dead grass and chew on that. Two remained, and on came creeping death. A strange bird that we could not identify, like an angel of caution, hovered in space, as still as a helicopter. The wind was prevailing, and he only had to flutter now and then, but he did not move. And occasionally this bird screamed her warning, but the bulls were indifferent. The one in the most imminent danger finally shifted to the safe side. The other one turned and looked directly toward the lion, but couldn't discern the danger. And as his head swung back around, he stroked his cud as though to say, peace, peace, when there was no peace. And then he looked away again, and the whole herd was relaxed. All of their heads were down. Gathering for their bellies was top priority, and the lion moved ever closer. We sat motionless under the African sun, and in our hearts, with our cameras ready and our fingers beginning to tremble, we wondered, how long? How long? And then we saw those dark ears change. He laid them back against his neck. Mrs. Woodfork was peering through her single lens reflex. A shudder of tension shivered through the fauna hosts. All of them sensed the trouble, the drama unfolding, except the watchman. And because the herd trusted them, they were oblivious to the danger. For a moment, I wished that zebras and ostriches knew how to scream. Somebody needed to cry aloud and spare not. Somebody needed to say, destruction cometh. Suddenly, there was a blur of brownish terror. Suddenly, a furious propulsion of power, as death armed with fang and claw bolted, assaulting the tower. The prime target, the complacent watchman. Sharp, hooked claws reached for flank, blindsiding this sentinel. But mercifully, his instincts took over. Perhaps he smelled what he could not see, and his sharp hoofs dug into the dry gray earth. The dust swirled like little sun devils, and at the same time there was a distressed snort, and hundreds of heads jerked up. The grazing ended. The herd was alerted. Their eyes flashed and rolled in fear. Their nostrils dilated. The tasteless, dry morsels of immediate gratification were not important now. Desire failed. Survival was all that counted. Death with opened canine maw unleashed all of its potential fury. The zebras flinched and whirled, beating a tattoo with their hoofs as they went off in the opposite direction. Ostriches turned and made off at 35 miles per hour in ungainly flight. And suddenly the lion pulled up in frustration, and Mrs. Woodfork whispered, "Thank you, Jesus." The old bull had just barely escaped. The enemy was thwarted. And we started to drive away, only to stop suddenly as hundreds of wildebeests panicked and got down to business. They started bolting for the right side. It was like a revival. It stopped traffic. The thunder of their hoofs was answered by the antiphonal applause of zebra hoofs banging the parched earth. The old lion tried again to look harmless and laid down, frustrated to be sure, but with a keener, meaner appetite. And with feline devilment in its brain, he must have started planning the next assault. How shall I take the watchman and scatter the herd? So thou, O Son of Man, I have set thee a watchman unto the house of Israel. Therefore thou shalt hear the word at my mouth, that's the only word, and warn them from me. When I say unto the wicked, O wicked man, thou shalt surely die, if thou dost not speak to warn the wicked from his way, and the wicked man shall die in his iniquity, his blood will I require at thine hand. Nevertheless, if thou warn the wicked of his way, to turn from it, if he do not turn from his way, he shall die in his iniquity, but thou hast delivered thy soul. The safety of the herd, the congregation, the constituent members all across this nation are depending on you and upon me.